Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Change the Air interview. My name is Kendra Seymour, and I'm beyond thrilled to talk to our guest today, Scott Forsgren. We are going to talk about a model for recovery from mold, Lyme disease, and other biotoxins. And I promise you, you don't want to miss this episode. So grab a pen and paper if you're old school like me, or bookmark this episode because you're going to want to refer back to it. So that said, welcome, Scott.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you.
A little background on Scott. He is an FDN-P, a health coach, a blogger, a podcaster, a health writer, and advocate. He is editor and founder of BetterHealthGuy.com, where he shares his 25-year journey through the world of Lyme disease and mold illness and the myriad of factors that chronic illness often entails. His podcast, Better Health Guy Blogcast, interviews many of the leaders in the field and is available on his website, BetterHealthGuy.com, and YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Audible. He has been interviewed on numerous podcasts and has lectured on his recovery from chronic illness at conferences and on several online summits. He has written for the Townsend Letter and other publications. He's founder of the Forum for Integrative Medicine, which hosts an annual conference bringing together some of the top integrative practitioners to share practical tools for treating complex chronic illness. And on a personal note, Scott has been a huge influence and important resource in my life for years. You were one of the first people, Scott, I think I've told you this before, that I stumbled upon when my journey began so many years ago. So I'm not alone when I want to say thank you for everything that you do to empower people.
Thank you. That's an honor. I mean, really taking my own journey, if there wasn't an opportunity to help people on a broader scale, it wouldn't have been quite as meaningful. So it's a great honor. Thank you so much.
It's an inspiration for all of us that we can really take control and empower ourselves to live a better and healthier life. So, Scott, tell us a little bit about your personal journey with chronic Lyme disease and mold illness.
Yeah, so back in the days of the dinosaurs, around 1996, I had a tick bite here in Northern California, and I was fine for several months. April of 1997, over the course of a weekend, got what seemed like a flu times 100. I mean, I just never had experienced anything like it. So it took some time for me to really have my health kind of fall apart. Probably my most significant symptom was neurological pain, so kind of a head to toe burning sensation. Felt like a sunburn, but it was 24/7 and just went on and on and on. Had a lot of balance issues at the beginning. So walking across a room was kind of like the extent of what I could do for the day. Sitting up in a chair, I constantly felt like I was just falling onto the floor. Same thing, laying in bed at night. I had to put pillows along one side of the bed just so I mentally knew I wasn't rolling off onto the floor. Lots of other, you look at symptoms of Lyme disease and mold illness and they overlap tremendously, but visual issues, floaters, lines, squiggles, lots of gut issues, memory issues, this motor-like tapping sensation that felt like my left foot was on the hood of a car, just this constant kind of tapping. So lots of neurological things, crawling sensations, light sensitivity, sound sensitivity, of course, going through that, the fear, the anxiety, the depression, the OCD, like, is this my life? All of those kinds of things. And so from 1997 to 2005, I went to 45 different doctors, neurologists, infectious disease doctors, pretty much anybody I could find. And most of them referred me to a psychiatrist. I could have created a psychiatry referral network back at that point. It was so ridiculous. I did get a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia shortly after things first started. But, back then there wasn't even, Google, there wasn't a lot of information online. You couldn't find anything more than chronic fatigue syndrome generally resolves in about a decade. That didn't sound hopeful. It wasn't something I was willing to wait and see if that was the case. And so 2005, I started over. That was, I think, doctor number 46. He referred me to a lady that she was an acupuncturist. She worked at an outlet mall next to a coffee shop, did this weird thing called electrodermal screening or electroacupuncture according to Vol, EAV. It's a computer-based system of energetic testing. And he said, the only thing that could be wrong with you is you must be reactive to foods. And so I want you to go find out from her what foods to avoid, and then that should solve your problem. What she said said after a couple hours of evaluating me was, I would have your doctor test you for Borrelia, the spirochetan Lyme, Bartonella, Babesia, Ehrlichia, like this is a serious thing. You need to really get on it. And I kind of walked out thinking like, really, is this where I'm going to find the answer to all of these problems? And so, I took my time a little bit, and she urged me again. So I did go back to the doctor. We had to repeat some of the blood tests over a period of time, but ultimately everything she picked up using her system of evaluation, we had confirmation for. And so that was, really kind of opened my mind. It wasn't something I was really open to at the time. It certainly piqued my interest in energetic testing. That's how I then kind of connected with Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt, who became my biggest mentor. And energetic testing really became another tool, a significant tool in my toolbox. And so, at this point, I really fortunate. I mean, I work more than I probably should. I go work out every morning. I don't have any physical limitations. I'm super blessed. It's been a journey, lots of lessons. I think one of the messages for me was that I wasn't really prioritizing myself at the time that I got sick. I had just started working in Silicon Valley after college, and you're a startup company. You're working all the time. You're drinking 12 Diet Cokes a day. You're eating pizza. You're all these things that certainly weren't creating a platform for health. So at this point, I'm just grateful. I'm blessed. It's been a journey, but lots of gifts and important perspectives that I've gained from it as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I know when I got bit by a tick, to really understand the level of sickness and myriad of symptoms and the dizziness. I remember my doctor, she's like, I want you to walk heel to toe, like they do when a police officer might pull you over. And I couldn't do it. And I remember thinking, oh, I have children that I'm driving around. If a police officer pulls me over, I can't blame a tick bite. But just the living with that day in and day out, it really takes a toll on your mental health, not just your physical health.
Absolutely.
With the 17 years since your diagnosis of Lyme and shortly thereafter mold illness, has a model for recovering health emerged from your journey? And how would you approach recovery if you were starting your journey over?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the way my mind thinks about these things now is really just the universe having connected me to some amazing people, the Dietrich Klinghardts and the Neil Nathans and the Simon Yus and Raj Patels and Amy Dirksons and, people that I just sometimes pinch myself when I was in a room thinking like, how did I even get here? And so, I certainly don't take credit for a lot of this, but I would say that what we're going to talk about is a generalized approach. It doesn't mean every step will apply for every person. It doesn't mean the order will be the same, but it's a conversation starter with your practitioner, hopefully. And so just kind of quickly running through the 11 steps. The first step is supporting detoxification and drainage. Step 2 is looking at the external environment, so mold, EMFs, those kinds of things. Step 3 is optimizing sleep. Step 4 is looking at the mental emotional contribution to our health situation. Step 5 is the limbic system, the vagus nerve, calming the autonomic nervous system. There is a distinction between the limbic system and the mental emotional piece. A lot of times people kind of merge those together, and I don't think that that's necessarily a great way to look at it. Step 6 is stabilizing mast cells, reducing inflammation, looking at immune modulation. So a lot of times it's not about killing a bug, but it's like, okay, well, lots of people have these bugs. Why is my, neighbor not having any symptoms at all, and yet I have this whole body that's kind of fallen apart? Step 7 is optimizing some of the basics like hydration, nutrition, the microbiome, the gut health. Step 8 is looking at the adrenals, the mitochondria. How do we create the energy to heal? And then looking at a couple of conditions that I think people commonly overlook, one being cryptopyroluria or KPU. That's something Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt talks a lot about. And then the other being hypercoagulation. I think that is probably the most important thing that is overlooked in these conditions. And certainly in the pandemic era,
Right.
I think lots of people are getting more of an understanding about thick blood and what that means. Step 9 then is addressing the microbial overgrowths, and we'll get into more about, potential order and what things to look at in that step. Step 10 is the dental contribution. So do we have cavitations, potentially dental infections, root canals, those kinds of things. And then step 11 is, once you've addressed all of those, what can we do to regenerate, to restore, to rebuild the body after it's been through usually not months, usually years or decades of chronic health challenges. And so those are the 11 steps that we're going to talk more about.
So let's start with step one, detoxification and drainage. So what's the difference and why is it so critical? And what makes this number one in your mind?
So I see detox and drainage really as the foundation. I think that the terrain is really the critical piece of this whole conversation. If we didn't have a toxic body burden of environmental toxicants, I don't think that these infections would make us as sick as they do. So in my mind, improving the terrain really is the road back to health. We can also think about some organisms like Candida or Candida, parasites, where the body may actually allow those in some type of synergistic way to protect us from heavy metals. And so I'm thinking of detoxification, terrain-focused work as also a indirect antimicrobial strategy. What can we do to change the environment so that we don't need some of these microbes? Not all microbes are bad. This first piece of this really is, and this is one I probably didn't do a great job initially, but you don't have to detoxify things that you never bring into your body. So, what are we thinking about with personal care products and scented products and plugins for fragrances and laundry products and all those things? And then making sure that our air, our food, our water is as pure as possible. And so I think that's a big piece. Implants of many kinds can also be something that need to be considered, whether it's breast implants or metal implants, things like that, that can be a source of toxins in the system as well. So for me, detoxification is more about binders of some kind to minimize enterohepatic recirculation of toxins. So when the toxins are concentrated in the liver into the bile, moving then into the gallbladder and the small intestine, a lot of that bile is reabsorbed by the body, and thus the toxins are reabsorbed. So what can we do to minimize that reabsorption and maximize excretion? And drainage then is, how do we support the beautiful blueprint that we all have in our amazing bodies, which is the liver, the gallbladder, the kidneys, the lymphatic system, the extracellular matrix, the colon, skin, lungs, all of those channels of elimination or emunctories or drainage pathways. So those exit routes really have to be optimized. You can't heal if you're constipated. That's a very important first thing to consider. The gallbladder is critical. So talking about this whole bile flow piece, if you're not able to create bile and have bile flow that's moving those toxins through into the small intestine, you can take lots of binders, but they may not have anything to bind to because most of them are not systemically absorbed. They're really working in the gut. There's lots of great tools out there. For many years, I've been a fan of Takasumi Supreme from Supreme Nutrition. Cellcore Biosciences has a lot of good tools. And then we have things like chlorella, zeolite, bentonite clay, with the caution that you really want to make sure your bentonite clay source is clean, because it can have lead and other things in it. In the drainage realm, then I'm thinking more commonly kind of first line of homeopathic tools. So Picana, Energetics, Desbio. How do we support the liver, the kidneys, the lymphatics, and the extracellular matrix? There are certainly herbal tools that we can use in this realm as well. So milk thistle or dandelion for the liver, or solidago for the kidneys, or red root for the lymphatics, for example. And so that's kind of the distinction between detox and drainage. I do think that trace minerals are really critical here as well. If we have adequate minerals in the body doesn't need to hold on to metals. That's kind of a second best thing to complete various enzymatic things in the body. Silica can also be a great tool for dealing with aluminum toxicity, which is a huge issue. Dr. Klinghardt talks about aluminum as kind of being the fuel for the Lyme fire that really kind of feeds Borrelia. And then movement is important. Like, unfortunately, we're not going to get well if we can't do some kind of movement. And I'm not suggesting you exercise beyond your capacity, but walking and starting slow and moving. I mean, walking is a phenomenal lymphatic support. We need to keep those fluid flows really moving. And then there's a whole list of really adjunct things you can do in this realm. For me, my number one tool has always been coffee enemas. And I know people are like, coffee, what? But
Yeah.
there really is science behind it. I've done a podcast with a doctor in Mexico that does a lot of the Gerson-based work, and we really kind of dug into that. Colonics, ionic foot baths, castor oil packs, oil pulling, liver gallbladder flushes can be great, but I really urge people not to do those on their own. They should have some medical supervision because they're not an easy thing to go through. And then sauna really can be fantastic as well. I mean, we can sweat out a lot of things, and that's great, but I don't think that's what I would start with. I think if you have adrenal issues, if you're not able to sweat, if you are then mobilizing toxins inside the body, then potentially you're going to redistribute toxins because you don't have those channels of elimination kind of fully open. So I think sauna is a nice tool a little bit later in the process, but that's really what I think of in, step one, detoxification and drainage and terrain optimization.
No, those are great bits of information and things that people can use, and especially that constipation piece. I feel like that is such a problem by and large for many people in the country, and to keep that in mind. Now, when we move on to step two, improving our external environment, I really love this one. Why is it so important, and how do we do it?
Well, you are the step two goddess, right? So, I think our internal environment is only ever going to be as healthy as our external environment. We can't expect to be healthier than the things that surround us. And we can take supplements all day long, but if our external environment in our home, sadly, our schools, our workplace, if those are our kryptonite, we're not going to get back to our Superman or Supergirl kind of superhero status, right? I mean, it really is a big deal. And so I would say mold. And when we say mold, we're really talking about this whole soup of things that happen in indoor environments. Mold is really not the full picture, but we kind of generalize to say mold. It's really kind of inaccurate at this point. There's lots of other things, but we often can use mold-based testing as a surrogate indicator for the health of a building. And so there are no perfect tests in this realm, but I think the environmental relative moldiness index, the ERMI from Mycometrics or Envirobiomics, is an excellent tool, as excellent as can be in the self-testing realm. The ideal scenario, if you're really sick, is you get a professional, indoor environmental professional IEP to come in and do really professional testing. But for some people, that's not the place that they can start. So an ERMI can be helpful. Then you can calculate a HERTZ-Me2 score, which is an algorithm that can also provide some insights. Immunolytics plate tests, where you can put out a plate and then watch for some growth of mold. That's another nice tool. I don't think it's the only tool. I think the ERMI and the self-testing realm is kind of the lead, and then the immunolytics is more adjunctive. And then we can also look at, I am a fan of urine mycotoxin testing, and I know it's highly debated, but real-time labs has been tremendously helpful for many people. There's other ones out there, Vibrant, Great Plains, those kinds of things. Of course, there are mycotoxins that we get exposed to from food sources, but you have to look at the levels and you look at the patterns when you repeat this over time, and that really can provide a lot of information. I would say in Dr. Nathan's world, that is kind of the number one tool that he really relies on. So once we identify an exposure, then we either have to remediate it or move. I tend to think, unless it's a really serious problem, that remediation is often a reasonable direction, because many people move from one place to the next to the next. And given that maybe 50 to 90% of buildings, if you talk to Brian Carr, he's going to say 90%, have some degree of mold, you're kind of trading one problem for another. So I think remediations can be successful if the IEP feels like it's possible. There are going to be some places you're just never going to get to a point where you are able to become well in the environment that you became sick in. That's reality in some cases. Air filtration, I think, is important, but I think that's after you fix the source of the problem. It's not going to, if there's a hole in the bottom of the boat and the boat is sinking, air filters are kind of like bailing the water out with a paper towel if you haven't first plugged the hole. So I'm not a fan of using air filters as a way to avoid a problem. I'm not a fan of using fogging as a way to avoid the problem. You have to remove the tumor before you start the chemotherapy. In other kind of tools that come to mind in this realm, eliminating the exposure, again, important, but there are some great tools that are coming out now from companies like Cellcore Biosciences, Beyond Balance, that are a little. Research Nutritionals is another one with their MycoPull product that are a little more focused in this realm. Things like cholestyramine and Welchol can be helpful, but they're often difficult for people to tolerate. Cholestyramine particularly can be very constipating, so you kind of have to, sometimes people can use a little cholestyramine and then use some natural binders at the same time. I don't think that people have to use cholestyramine. And then later, when we get to step 9, we'll talk more about the possibility that you could have become colonized from ongoing inhalation of Aspergillus, for example, and maybe then you do need to do some antifungals as part of this whole process as well. So I think once you rule out mold exposure, a very significant roadblock to your healing process has been removed. And I know, I'm sure you see this as well. This is the piece people want to avoid and find every way to navigate around. But it will extend the duration of your health challenges, and unfortunately also extend the amount of money it's going to take you to move past them. EMFs are another big part of this. Dr. Klinghardt started educating me in 2006 when I became his patient. At the time, he wouldn't take patients that weren't doing good EMF hygiene. So, people back then were laughing at him, thinking, oh, who's this, German crazy person talking about EMFs? And, nobody's laughing anymore, right? I mean, he's always a couple decades ahead of the curve. So I think of EMFs as another environmental toxicant. They can impact our ability to detoxify. They can keep us in a sympathetic, dominant, stressed state. So we want to do things like turning off our Wi-Fi, not having cordless phones. I sleep in a Faraday cage with silver-lined cloth and have since Dr. Klinghardt required that in 2006. Sometimes turning off the circuit breakers can be great as well. And so those are all things that I did early on. Also looking at things like dirty electricity. Do you need some Stetzer filters or green wave filters or something like that to avoid those kinds of fields that can impact you also? Dr. Klinghardt would say that probably the primary growth factor for molds in a water damaged building is the level of EMF. So he's going to say, if you have a mold problem, you need to turn off your Wi-Fi as like step 1. Like anything else you do could be helpful, but it's not going to be helpful if those molds are growing more rapidly, if they're putting out more mycotoxins because they feel threatened by the environment and all of these EMFs. There's also a correlation between EMFs and heavy metal toxicity. So the more toxic we are with metals, the more we are an antenna essentially for these man-made frequencies in our environment. And so that's something to think about as well. But EMFs and mold, primarily external environment, improving that to create a healing environment for our forward progress.
So obviously wise words there, and at Change the Air Foundation, we hope to unpack that external environment for you a little bit more. I think it was Dr. Hyman who talked about if you step on a tack, it's going to take a lot of aspirin for it to feel better. And the treatment is to remove the tack. And so keeping that external environment as healthy as possible is important. For step 3, optimizing sleep. Why does this come after our external environment around us? I know I'm a mom. Nighttime is the only time I get to myself, and it's hard to be like, all right, stop what I'm doing and get a good night's rest. So can you help us understand that a little more?
Yeah, so this also was, based on a lot of my mentoring with Dr. Klinghardt, where he would suggest that EMF exposure is the primary cause of insomnia. So we're trying to first create that environment that's going to support sleep by doing a lot of that EMF hygiene. And then, there's lots of supplements, the GABAs and the Hinokiols or Magnolia, the 5-HTP, all of those things, those can be helpful. I mean, I've always joked that melatonin is my drug of choice, and I, still do take it and still feel like it's very helpful. But a lot of times we need to look at things like, how is your blood sugar moving while you're sleeping? Is it getting low enough that then your body says, oh, I need to produce cortisol to bring the blood sugar back up, but then you can't get back to sleep because now you've got this cortisol that's kind of, moving through your blood. Looking at oxygen saturation. So is there potentially some sleep apnea type issue? Fortunately, there's lots of tools now, even the Aura Ring, which is one that I like for measuring sleep, but it also now looks at the oxygen levels and things. So it's nice that we have some technologies where we can get some insights around this. Weighted blankets, incline bed therapy. Incline bed therapy can really be helpful for a number of things, but including some of that lymphatic and drainage that we talked about earlier. There's devices in this realm. Brain Tap from Dr. Patrick Porter can be helpful. The Apollo band that does a vibration to kind of calm the system can be great. The other piece that we're going to talk about later is the histamine piece. So if these things aren't working and someone has mast cell activation and histamine intolerance, then the histamine itself could be part of the sleep problem. So anything we can do here is just going to exponentially accelerate our healing process. And that's why sleep is so important and at the very beginning of this whole process.
And I feel like something you can really prioritize if you decide to commit to it. Talk to us about step 4, the mental and emotional health. Does that say, as many have been told, that the problem is all in our head? I know many of us have heard this or some version of that.
Yeah, I mean, it is probably all in our head, but not in the way that we've been invalidated through the medical community. And so I do think that many of us have had emotional traumas and conflicts that set the stage for the development of our illnesses. Others, that invalidation from the medical community can then create a trauma. So either way, I think we have to explore this to really maximize our outcome. Certainly, we all have emotional traumas and conflicts, and that doesn't mean that the illness is all in the mental emotional realm, but we know that mental emotional factors influence the development of physical illnesses. So my observation in the Lyme community has been that a common pattern is a type A plus overachiever perfectionist that oftentimes doesn't feel they deserve to be well, and they need to do to prove their worth and value to the world. And, guilty as charged. So
me too. Me too.
it's super rare. I used to joke that I haven't yet seen a type B surfer dude come in from the beach and go, "Oh, my life was great till I got bit by that tick." But then it actually happened once, and so the whole story kind of got ruined. But in Dr. Klinghart's realm, his 5 levels of healing model, this is 3rd level work. So when you're doing mental emotional work, that affects the energy body and the physical body. So things you can do on these levels are often much more profound than just taking supplements. Cultivating good relationships, eliminating toxic ones, which can be hard, but it is really important. And then I also think it's important not to identify with the illness. I've always been very resistant to the term Limey. I know lots of people think of that as a community, and for them that may be fine. But I think if you identify with that and that becomes not a part of you, but it becomes who you are, that it's much more difficult then to move past it. It becomes your identity. And so, in this realm, I really like EMDR. I think that's a great system. Dr. Klinghart's work with applied psychoneurobiology or psychokinesiology or family constellation work can be great. Systems of tapping like EFT or emotion code can be very good. And for people that are open to going here, and for some people, talk therapy can be helpful, but really what I think a lot of times that also can be re-traumatizing. And what we're kind of looking at here is, how do you remove the cellular imprint or cellular memory of a trauma from your field? And so I really like the work of Amy B. Scher and her book, How to Heal Yourself When No One Else Can. Just fantastic. It goes through specific scripts and tapping and things you can do to help get rid of a lot of this imprint. And I think it's just a profound resource. And this whole area is so important to look at. Unfortunately, it is one that a lot of times people work through a lot of the other steps first, and then eventually, and this was me as well, then eventually you kind of go, uh-oh, I need to do something in the mental emotional realm, and then you kind of come back to it. But ideally, it would be done earlier.
I think that's important too. For as much as we all make mistakes on this journey. So, you may have to backtrack and reverse or pivot, and you just keep going and do the next thing. I'll have to check that book out. For step number 5, retraining the limbic system and toning the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so the limbic system is the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus. It's kind of the alarm center. So, is our environment safe? The things that we smell and see and hear and taste and feel. And so I think of it as kind of the anxiety switch. And unfortunately, a lot of times it becomes very trigger happy. And so the limbic system affects the immune system, the endocrine system, the autonomic nervous system. We know the autonomic nervous system affects blood pressure and heart rate and breath and digestion and all of those things. So, this is kind of a higher level control center, and lots of things can lead to what we call limbic system impairment. That could be water damage building exposure. It could be a chemical or a pesticide. It could be an organism. It could be some other type of physical, mental, or emotional trauma. And in this realm, essentially what happens is, let's say your mold exposure was your tiger, and your brain, your limbic system said, oh my gosh, this is a tiger, and I need to release all these stress chemicals, and we need to run. You fix your house, you remediate it. It's relatively good. It's the kitten walking outside the street. But when your brain sees the kitten, it says, oh my God, the tiger is here, and I need to respond in that same way that I responded to the tiger. So in my mind, these systems are largely about recalibrating your perception of threat to be more correct in terms of the actual threat. So not over perceiving the level of threat. And so we're using things like Annie Hopper's work with dynamic neural retraining system, Ashok Gupta's work with the Gupta program. Those are fantastic tools. They're a little more driver's seat, meaning you have to commit and you have to do some hard work. There are other tools like Brain Tap and things like that, frequency specific microcurrent, another one where you can work on the limbic system, the vagus nerve. Ideally, you would work on the limbic system and the vagus nerve simultaneously. So again, Brain Tap, frequency specific microcurrent can help with the vagus nerve. There's vagal nerve stimulators. There's gargling, singing, playing the didgeridoo. I think one of the more profound ones is probably the exercises from Stanley Rosenberg's book, Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve.
That's
And
a good one.
so yeah. And so that's, lots of things here that we can do, but the main message is that we can't heal when we're in a fight, flight, or freeze type mode. We have to calm the system as much as possible, be in a parasympathetic state so that we can detoxify and that we can move our health forward.
Yeah, that's a step I've been working on. And when life gets busy, I tend to forget about and have to make a point to revisit. Now, for step 6, stabilizing mast cells, reducing inflammation, modulating the immune response, why is this so important?
I think many people think of this process as if I could just kill these bugs, I'd be healthy. That's how I thought about it at the
Right.
beginning. Now I think it's actually probably the less important or least important part of this process relative to detox and mental emotional health and those things. So a lot of the inflammation that we experience symptoms from is going to be driven by mast cell activation syndrome. Lots of things trigger it. The primary ones I think about: water damage building exposure, parasites, EMFs, Lyme, environmental toxins, all those things certainly play a role as well. Interestingly, Dr. Theo Harides, mast cell master, amazing, studied this realm for 30 plus years. He made the comment at a conference I was at a few years ago that mast cells are 10 times more active in the presence of a cell phone. And I knew a lot of this, but even for me, that was the thing that really stuck in my mind from that conference, that it was like, wow, 10 times more, that's huge. So when we're thinking about this realm, the first thing to do is minimize the intake or the consumption of histamine producing foods or histamine in our diet. So things like kombucha or avocados or bone broth or fermented foods. People say, oh, my practitioner told me those are all great healing things, but there's a right place and a right time. And if you have mast cell activation, those are not going to be good things to do.
Right.
Once you then eliminate what's coming in from the diet, then you start bringing in some mast cell stabilizers and histamine reducers: quercetin, holy basil, luteolin, Dr. Theo created one called Neuroprotect that's been consistently helpful over the years. Dr. Ben Lynch has his probiotic Histamine X, which is the probiotics that are histamine degrading. Most probiotics are bad in this realm as well. Dr. Chris Shade and his Hista Aid from Quicksilver, another tool. So lots of things that we can do. And then at the same time, we need to get rid of the tack that you mentioned about earlier, right? I do not, some do, but I do not view mast cell activation as the core issue. I view that as the result of a tack. So that is what we need to really be focused on. So we're doing a lot of the things we just talked about to feel better, to move past a lot of our symptoms, but we still need to bring resolution to the triggers. So the other piece of this would be, what can we do to modulate inflammation? So there's a lot of the pro-resolving mediators, SPM active, or Microbiome Labs gut-specific fish oil. And I was not part of the marketing team that named that product.
Yeah.
And then immune modulation. So low dose naltrexone. I think that plays an important role for many people. Is it magic for everyone? No. Low dose immunotherapy with Ty Vincent's work, remarkable for many people. It's been remarkable for me personally. Homeopathy, Dr. Sam Yannick, he's got his whole, through Cogence Immunology, his whole teaching about immune modulation. And then he's partnered with Pure Encapsulations and created a whole line of tools in this realm. So, the message is that getting well is not about boosting the immune system. Many people say, oh, what can I take to boost my immune system? Well, if you have a hypervigilant, overactive, autoimmune responding immune system, you don't want to boost it. You want to modulate, calm, create integration with our microbes. And another tool that can be really helpful in this realm, in fact, I think this is the step where peptides probably shine the most. So the thymosins, the thymosin alpha 1, which is much more difficult to get. I'm not sure that we can even get it anymore. Thymosin beta 4, KPV, BPC 157, those kinds of things can really help in this immune modulation and kind of calming realm. And I think this is more important than killing the microbes. So that is step 6.
No, that's super important. I have a child with pandas, and I remember I was thinking, well, we'll boost her immune system. And the doctor explaining to me why that was not the way to go. And it was really the first time someone had explained the importance of modulation to me. And now I think about it in a completely different context than I had previously.
Yeah, absolutely.
For step 7, optimizing hydration, nutrition, microbiome, and gut health, what tools do you find helpful here?
Again, these are very basic things, but also things that I probably jumped past at the beginning of my journey. So a lot of people with biotoxin illness drink water all day, pee it out, still cellularly dehydrated. So sometimes structuring water, adding some electrolytes, adding some trace minerals, a pinch of sea salt, something like that can be great. There are some really advanced waters that we can buy. I personally have never been super drawn to them because it costs more to ship them than it does for the water. And it just becomes so expensive that I don't think it's realistic for most of us. Remembering that the immune system largely comes from the gut. So getting rid of those triggering foods, working on intestinal hyperpermeability or leaky gut as well. Making sure that the things that we're consuming are as nutrient dense as possible. So for me, that means a power shake every morning. Sometimes, depending on the amount of psyllium that goes into it, it becomes a power pudding. But things like a good high quality protein, healthy fats, phospholipids, phosphatidylcholine, maybe some flax seeds, chia seeds, organic nut milk, those kinds of things. That's really what I tend to focus on, making sure that we're getting out the triggers. Like I personally think for everyone that has these conditions, gluten it's not a good thing to do. It's another thing you're justifying in some way, but I don't think it's going to be health supporting. Cow dairy is going to be bad for many or most people. A2 dairy may be a little better, sheep a little better, goat a little better. Sugar is going to be bad for most people. The high histamine foods that we talked about. There's all kinds of diets. I think early on in the process, the one that I consistently see bringing the most progress is going to be the low histamine diet. It's unfortunately not a super easy diet to do, but it can have tremendous benefits for people. Supporting the microbiome. I'm a huge fan of the Megaspore biotic, and Kieran Krishnan's work tends to be tolerated well even when people are still doing with mast cell activation, or SIBO provides those keystone strains that can really help to optimize the diversity of our microbiome, is immune and inflammation modulating as well, can help support the healing of leaky gut. Other things like the Ion Gut Health from Dr. Zach Bush, or what used to be called Restore, can be great as well. So, these are not complex things, but if we're doing the more complex things and we're not getting some of the basics right, we're not optimizing our outcome. And so that's why I think these are important to look at and make a few small adjustments.
Yeah, and that nutrition piece, I know if you have young children, it can seem overwhelming, but from personal experience, it is possible. And when you do it as a family, or people in the home, and you kind of commit to it, it gets easier over time. It really does. You just have to take those first steps. For step 8, it's about adding supportive interventions such as mitochondrial support, adrenals, KPU, coagulation. As you said, we've heard a lot about that lately with the pandemic the last few years. Can you tell us more about these?
Yeah, so I think historically most people tend to think more of adrenal exhaustion. I think some adaptogen support, ashwagandha, those types of things can be helpful. I mean, certainly the adrenals need some support, but I think over the past few years, largely from mentoring with Dr. Todd Watts and learning about some of his work, I think the importance of the mitochondria is maybe even starting to become more important than some of the adrenal work. I mean, I do think for adrenals, another great tool is holy basil. I mean, it checks lots of boxes in this whole conversation. Antimicrobial, supporting the adrenals, dealing with some of the mast cell and histamine piece. So, I mean, I like tools that check lots of boxes, because most of us probably have protocols that are, way too big.
Right.
Mitochondrial support, there's going to be the normal, CoQ10 and PQQ. There's lots of different types of NAD precursors now. I think red light therapy can be a phenomenal support for the mitochondria. There's some people starting to explore methylene blue in the mitochondrial conversation. But what we can do to bring those things in that will allow the body to produce ATP, or energy, which is the currency of healing. If we don't have that energy, we can't heal. Another really important piece of this conversation was handed to me recently by Dr. Neil Nathan, a book from Dr. Derek Lonsdale and Dr. Chandler Mars. I did a podcast there as well, but this is thiamine deficiency, vitamin B1. And there's a very specific type of vitamin B1, not benfotiamine, which is better than normal thiamine hydrochloride, but it's a TTFD form. There's products like Thiamax, allithiamine, lipothiamine that can be really, really helpful in being able to create energy. So that's the adrenals, that's the mitochondria. Cryptopyruluria is a condition that Dr. Klinghardt really highlighted in the Lyme and autism conversation. It's been around way before Dr. Klinghardt. This is back in the Abram Hoffer and Carl Pfeiffer and some of those people back in like the 1950s. But it essentially means that you pee out your zinc and B6, and your immune system then, as Dr. Klinghardt would say, becomes like an army with no bullets. So we have to then support zinc and B6 and some of these other cofactors that are needed and depleted if we have the condition. You have to go slow. You don't want to do it too fast. If someone who's zinc depleted starts introducing a lot of zinc, you can really trigger inflammation. You can release metals. I mean, it's always a marathon, not a sprint. And I do not think that we should push through difficult interventions. I think if the body is really pushing back, there's a reason. It's either we don't have enough detox support, or we're being too aggressive, but it shouldn't be a miserable process to move towards health. The last piece, the hypercoagulation piece, this I've been mentored originally by David Berg, but more recently by Dr. Ann Corson. She makes this a big focus of her work. Ruth Kriz as well also talks about this a lot in the interstitial cystitis population. Yeah. And so I think There are panels of tests that should be done. If we have thick blood, we're not getting nutrient delivery or supplement or herb delivery optimally to deeper places in the body. We're not getting oxygen delivery. We're not getting optimized waste removal. So we might be looking at things like Baluch, which is a lumbrokinase, or maybe nattokinase, or some people may need other, heparin or Lovenox or things like that. But I think this is a piece that people should be really having a conversation with their practitioner to explore and rule out. Mold exposure, babesia, heavy metals, lots of things can trigger this hypercoagulation. And in my own journey, it was a huge missing piece of the puzzle. So that's step 8, just making sure that we're not missing some of those key things.
No, and I'm so glad you mentioned interstitial cystitis. That's something that I have personally struggled with. And I know in that community, they're searching for answers, and they need to start, considering some of these other things, because it is devastating at times. But for step 9, this is what I think everyone's been waiting for, those pesky little critters. How do we support the body with microbial overgrowths?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that kill is not the way back to health. Once we start supporting the body with these different pathogens, the order could potentially change as well. I tend to think about starting with the viral and retroviral support first, because I think those create a lot of symptoms, and I think they're generally well-tolerated interventions relative to some of the other things that maybe create more Herxheimer type reactions. So viruses, retroviruses, then thinking about parasites and gut and SIBO, then looking at fungal overgrowth, yeast, possible mold colonization, then Lyme and co-infections, maybe some biofilm support. I think most of us have some degree of reactivation of Epstein-Barr virus, HSV1 and 2, HHV6, herpes zoster. So herpes zoster from chickenpox, if you had chickenpox when you were a child. It's also the virus that causes shingles. That was a big player in my own journey. It is still something that, I really have to make sure that I'm doing all the right things to keep that from being an issue. And so the retroviral piece, Dr. Klinghardt talks a lot about how the retroviruses are made worse by electromagnetic field exposures as well. And once these things reactivate, they usually need longer term support. There's tools that Dr. Klinghardt's consulted on, from BioPure, the NV, the Cystis T, the Vital 9. Beyond Balance is another company that I really love. Cellcore has the Virad Chem tool. Things like sulforaphane, pantethine, selenium, lysine, all of those. And by the way, for me, the focus on herpes zoster, what really made a huge difference was low dose immunotherapy. So we really addressed that primarily back in the earlier step 6, not so much, with these antiviral type tools. So once we look at the viruses, the retroviruses, then getting to the gut, the parasites, the SIBO, the GI dysbioses, all of those kinds of things. Parasite testing is notoriously poor. Right. So I think you have to test with the functional medicine testing, but also if you're open to energetic testing, whether that's autonomic response testing or EAV. Dr. Simon Yu, he's brilliant with his acupuncture meridian assessment work, probably the, Dr. Yu and Dr. Klinghardt, 2 of the best in the world that evaluate parasites using energetic testing. I do like, from a more conventional testing perspective, Dr. Raphael D'Angelo with ParaWellness Research. They look at stool and urine under the microscope. He actually does it himself and finds lots of parasites that have not previously been identified. We're thinking here of nematodes and helminths and worms, but also some of the smaller things like Giardia or Cryptosporidium or Blastocystis or Toxoplasma. Actually, Blastocystis was one of the first things I identified when I first got sick. And so back then it was, Blastocystis is the unknown cause of everyone's illness. And I went down that path for a while, and that turned out not to be the case, but can still be a contributor. So I like to use herbal tools and homeopathy in this realm. So Paragen from Dr. David Jernigan's work, Cellcore, again, they now have their Para 1, 2, 3, 4, Beyond Balance, Byron White, all of those things. And then there are homeopathic, so frequency energy medicine, like energetics has one called paracord. UNDA number 39, UNDA number 39 is currently my favorite in the homeopathic realm for this support. SIBO, I think SIBO is less about a pathogen. I would say the overgrowth of the bacterial overgrowth is more the result than the cause, that it's more neurological. It's what we talked about earlier, calming the vagus nerve, calming the autonomic nervous system, supporting the migrating motor complex, supporting the bile flow, all of those things. And if you don't get those right, you treat, and every time you stop, the SIBO comes back.
Mhm.
So there can also be other types of dysbioses, whether that's Clostridia or Klebsiella. So I like things like biocidin or the megaspore biotic or IMNGI from Beyond Balance can be great. The fungal yeast and mold piece, again, it's debated, but if you're breathing aspergillus in and you get colonized with it, you can live in a clean room in a lab somewhere, but if your mycotoxin producing factory is inside of you, then you not only have to fix the external environment, but you've got to start working on the internal environment. So, this is an area, whether it's more yeast or candida or candida, however people want to pronounce that, lots of good tools. I like from the microbiome labs people, the Mega Mycobalance, which is a mix of a propolis and a very similar material to Thorn SF722, which is also a fantastic tool, or some of the combinations with the Beyond Balance and the Byron White and so on. Some practitioners will use pharmaceutical itraconazole in this realm, and that can be helpful for some people as well. And then we get into the Borrelias, the Bartonellas, the Babesias, all the Lyme and co-infection pieces, but also the opportunistic infections. So the mycoplasmas and the chlamydias and those kinds of things. I tend to not like to use super broad spectrum tools in this realm initially. I think it can be too much and can overload the system, that you want to unlayer things a little more methodically. So using formulas that are intended more for Borrelia support or Bartonella support or Babesia support, like Nutrimetics or Byron White formulas or Beyond Balance. And then once you've done that kind of unlayering process, then you can use things that are broader spectrum tools and better be able to tolerate them. Biofilms can play a role. I don't think everybody needs to address biofilms. Some people do fine without doing that. There's lots of enzyme products and things on the market. At this point, Dr. Klinghardt would say that Cystis T is going to be probably one of the better tools. It's a selective biofilm breaker. Not all biofilms are bad, so you don't want to be too aggressive in this realm. You also have to remember that as you're breaking down biofilms, that microbes and toxins and other things are coming out of them as well. So you still have to have the support on board for all of those things as well. In the pharmaceutical realm, I did 3.5 years of pharmaceutical antibiotics when I first got diagnosed with Lyme in 2005 after 8 years of really struggling. And I probably personally wouldn't do it again, but we didn't have a lot of these other tools. I am still open to it. Disulfiram is a good example of something in the last few years in the Lyme community that's been very helpful. There are other things that are emerging in that realm. So even though I now tend to be more focused on natural tools and not kill, we need every tool in the toolbox until we have a solution that works for everyone. So I would say in step 9, some of my favorite companies are going to be the BioPures, the Vital Plan with Dr. Rawls, the Supreme Nutrition from Dr. Leibowitz, the Beyond Balance, the DesBio, the MEPA Herbals, the Research Nutritionals, the Nutrimetics. I mean, we have so many good tools now. I think ozone can be very helpful in this realm as well. I would definitely say ozone's probably a top 10 intervention for me personally, working with a doctor that can help facilitate that. And then particularly if someone's really reactive to things they take orally, how can we use adjunct interventions that bring frequency, for example. So, I've collaborated with been an advisor to a company called Free Medica up in Canada that uses frequencies and delivers those through light in a way that can support the body without having to be something else that you take. And so, there's lots of things in this realm we could potentially explore, but I think we want to do, the step 1 through 8 before we really jump in aggressively into this killing piece, because it's probably not, realistically, we're not going to ever fully eradicate these organisms. When I say that, I think some people feel that they lose hope of recovering. I actually feel like it's very empowering because it's not a realistic goal. And so the idea that we don't have to kill every single one, that we're not sterile people, that we have 10 times more bugs in us and on us. We look human, but you're 10 times more bug than human, right? So I think that's an important thing to remember. For me, that was really empowering. Okay, I don't have to get rid of every one of these things. I just have to bring balance back.
I love that about the balance. Now, for step 10, you mentioned exploring dental contributors. And I love this because the science around the whole oral microbiome, if you will, has really been fascinating. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, so, Dr. Klinghardt and Dr. Simon Yu were probably two of my bigger mentors in this realm. I would say historically, some people have done this work earlier. Now, I would generally, Dr. Klinghardt would talk about dealing with some of the retroviruses first, maybe even some of the co-infections that Bartonella can play a big role in dental health. Dr. Yu would look at some of the parasites first, generally speaking. I mean, there's no black and white here. We could be thinking about amalgams and the contribution of metal. We could be thinking about root canals and their impact on the meridians that are associated with a tooth, and thus the organs associated with that tooth or meridian. But probably the bigger piece that many of us have had to go down this path is the cavitation conversation, which is, for me, having had my wisdom teeth removed in high school, getting a dry socket, having to have it packed, all of that stuff. That was, when I was a teenager. Years later, Dr. Simon Yu, I was at a conference and I said, hey, can I come have an appointment with you and see what you think? And, he found 2 cavitations, and I didn't tell him where they were. I knew exactly which one had been a dry socket in high school. And he said the lower right, almost certainly the upper right, I think is an issue as well. And I was like, oh, of course, he's exactly right. So that, produced a lot of anxiety about, going back in, scraping out the bone, doing all this kind of stuff. But the anxiety leading up to it was far worse than the procedure itself. I think the other piece, and you mentioned having a child that is dealing with some of the pandas type things as well. Tonsils can be a big contribution to some of the strep and those contributors to pandas as well. So, Dr. Klinghardt's always been a fan of the regenerative cryotherapy, which I did go do twice in Germany many years ago. But thinking about the tonsils when we're talking about oral health, thinking about what about the oral microbiome is affecting systemic health? Why is it that when they do autopsies of people with Alzheimer's that they find Treponema denticola or P. gingivalis? So we should be doing something every day that could be, an essential oil blend like Oral Defense from Supreme Nutrition, the dental Sidon products from Biobotanical Research. Research Nutritionals has a newer product that I like, which is actually a little lozenge that has the probiotics that are appropriate for the oral cavity. And so we want to make sure that we're, so even if there's not a significant issue, what can we do to support our oral health? Because that's going to affect our systemic health. And the other piece of this conversation, and part of why I put it at the end, is I think people need to have a conversation between what I call the captain of their ship, their primary doctor, and the biological dentist or surgeon, because unfortunately, timing is important. It's a stress to the system to do these procedures. You may need more antimicrobial support for your overall systemic focus. And so you don't want to jump to someone who's going to help in this realm without making sure that you're really aligning your whole team into when is the right time, How do we support you? How do we make sure you're going to heal? How do we minimize complications? And so that's another piece why I put this at the end, making sure that the body is well supported before you do something that can be more aggressive. And I have seen people jump into aggressive dental interventions and actually made themselves worse. So it is one to use some caution about and make sure that you're really thinking through all those possibilities.
No, that's great. Now, for step 11, the final step, you mentioned regeneration and restoration. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Dr. David Jernigan likes to say that he can get rid of the termites, but that after somebody has the termites gone, you still have some structural integrity issues you need to, repair. So I think some of these tools you could introduce earlier, but at some point when we've done all the detox and all these things we've talked about, reduce the microbes, we need to regenerate and restore the body. So bioidentical hormone replacement could make sense here. Progesterone very commonly can be helpful. However, you could introduce these things earlier, but there is an aspect of the cell danger response where the body is intelligently going into a protected hypometabolic state, maybe downregulating testosterone, for example. So if the body's putting on the brakes, you may not want to be pressing the gas pedal at the same time. In some cases, yes, this can come earlier, but a lot of times, even with thyroid medication, for example, there's a new book out called The Thyroid Debacle by Dr. Eric Balkavich and Dr. Kelly Halderman. That really is kind of the premise of the book is you don't want to start taking thyroid medication unless you're dealing with those things that are triggers for why the body is trying to slow down metabolism. And so that's definitely a good read and urge people to check that out. But bioidentical hormones, thyroid, those kinds of things could be helpful. The phospholipids that we talked about earlier, our cell membranes need healthy fats. If all we're getting is bad fats, we have bad fats in our cell membranes. So phosphatidylcholine, those blends that include other types of lipids as well that you can take orally, like I do in the Power Shake, but also there's IV phosphatidylcholine interventions as well. Dr. Patricia Kane being the one that really popularized those types of treatment interventions. Peptides can be great here as well, the BPC 157 and many others for repairing, restoring, regenerating the body. I think those really stand out. They are a little harder to get. The FDA is not completely on board with them. And so I do suggest that if people are working with peptides, work with a doctor, get them from a reliable source. You don't want to be getting things from the internet and injecting them into your body. I mean, that's just an unnecessary risk with potential for more complications. Photobiomodulation, so red light therapy here, again, supporting the mitochondria. Collagen is impacted through this whole process. Borrelia loves collagen, so red light therapy can also help to rebuild collagen. Stem cells, exosomes, those kinds of things. Historically, I haven't been super excited about them. I did stem cells in Panama many years ago before I had this whole way of thinking about things. I think they're not a get out of jail free card from a perspective of systemic health. I think if you have a knee issue or hip issue, something like that, that's more localized, they can be really helpful. But I'm watching. I'm seeing more of this exosome conversation. There's some great leaders in this realm that hopefully some of those tools become more consistently helpful and also cheaper. That many of us that don't have a lot of money can afford to do some of those things. The other thing that I regularly do, including just before we started this conversation, is something called exercise with oxygen therapy. So Live O2 essentially is exercising where you're switching between 85% oxygen and 14% oxygen and really flooding the body with oxygen, which can help to be a really good regenerative type tool. So there's lots of things here, but the main message is once you've gotten rid of the termites, there is going to be some restoration work that needs to be done in order to really optimize our overall picture.
I love this framework, and you've given us a lot of things to think about, but I know we're almost out of time. So any final words?
First, I'm excited to be here. I'm super excited to watch the work that you're doing with Change the Air Foundation. I think it's going to be fun to see all of the things that you guys do and appreciate that you're there and highlighting this issue. For practitioners that are listening, I am the co-founder of the Forum for Integrative Medicine. We'd love to see more practitioners join that conversation. We have an annual conference. If they want to learn more, it's forumforintegrativemedicine.org. I'm also, it's been almost 10 years that I've been on the board of directors of the Limelight Foundation. And so we work to provide treatment grants to children and young adults 25 and under that cannot otherwise access care for Lyme disease treatment due to financial constraints. We've given out now over $7 million to recipients in 49 states. Incredibly rewarding for me to give away somebody else's money and see like amazing changes in people's life. So if someone is listening and they're in need of that support or in a position to support that work, please feel free to check that out at limelightfoundation.org. And then I think the last comment that I would have, and maybe the most important, is there is more reason now to be hopeful than ever for us to recover health with these conditions. There's more research, there's more understanding, there's more brilliant people at the table than ever in dealing with chronic Lyme and illness from water damaged buildings and biotoxin illness. So many years I felt like we had the same tools, the same understanding, and then now it's just kind of like a rocket that there's actual research happening. There's companies developing products. There's all these great new tools and new solutions that are emerging. So for people listening that feel like they're in a stuck place, I was there and I've gotten to a very good place. And so be hopeful. There are solutions and people can absolutely get well.
I love that message of hope. And that's something, we hope to offer people too at Change the Air Foundation. But you've given us so many great resources to check out. Definitely Limelight Foundation, head on over there if you haven't. This journey can absolutely feel lonely and overwhelming, but Scott's blog podcast is here to help you change the air. And for anyone else who's listening today, we don't want you to miss out on great information and interviews like this one. So if you haven't headed over to changetheairfoundation.org and signed up for our newsletter, please do so. We have so much information and exciting things coming this year and hopefully beyond. And our goal is to always provide you with that reliable and actionable information so you can feel empowered and hopeful when talking with professionals and making those choices for you and your loved ones. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much.